The JJK universe, there are a multitude of different kinds of techniques. Well, yes, all techniques are curse techniques. Some curse techniques are extension curse techniques or maximum output curse techniques. And some are curse technique reversals. However, the vast majority of curse techniques in JJK fall into two buckets: innate techniques and inherited techniques, with inherited techniques being passed down through jujitsu families, and innate techniques being techniques that are unique to certain individuals, learned techniques. But because innate techniques are usually highly individual, that's where the vast amount of diversity in terms of techniques that we see in JJK come from. However, because inherited techniques can belong to multiple people, those tend to be the most common techniques we interface with in JJK. But what are all of these inherited techniques? How many of them is there and how do they work? And maybe more importantly than anything, what amongst them is the strongest? Well, today we're going to be answering all those questions and a whole lot more, because today we're talking all inherited techniques in JJK, ranked and explained. But before we get to ranking or explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in the description below. Naruto vs. Neji has officially started. So, believe it or not, in all of JJK, there are only 5 inherited curse techniques. And those 5 inherited curse techniques only belong to 4 families. And therefore, like we talked about earlier, the vast majority of diversity in terms of curse techniques comes from innate techniques rather than inherited techniques. But just because we're talking about innate techniques separate from inherited techniques does not mean a technique cannot be both innate and inherited. See, calling something an inherited technique just simply means that somebody gains access to this technique from the moment of their birth, because who they were born to, they are able to use this certain technique. However, that does not mean that down the line that person who was born with an inherited technique cannot develop innate techniques within the confines of that inherited technique. Take, for example, the red, blue, and purple of the Gojo clan's Limitless. Well, in order to gain access to the red, blue, or purple, you need to have the inherited technique of the Limitless. Red, blue, and purple are all innate techniques. Got it? Good. With that out of the way, let's get into our list. At number 5 on our list of JJK's inherited techniques, we have curse speech. Now, curse speech is the only inherited technique that does not come from one of the Jujutsu royal clans, as curse speech belongs to the Inumaki clan. That is, of course, seemingly until the era of Majulo, as it's revealed in Majulo that Cool Usami is also a curse speech user. And while we're not entirely sure what happened to the Inumaki family after the events of JJK, it's safe to assume if people whose last name is not Inumaki are using the curse speech technique, that the Inumaki family, possibly like the new Shadow style school, have opened up the teachings of their inherited technique to people outside of their clan. But that raises a couple of question marks on account of the fact that it is an inherited technique, implying that it's passed down through bloodline relation, meaning in some sense, based off at least what we know, that Usami must be somehow related to the Inumaki clan. Now, the idea of somebody using an inherited technique from a clan that they don't share the last name of is not unheard of, especially in Majulo, as even though Tsurugi and Yuka exist in the modern day iteration of the Gojo clan in Majulo, they have 2 abilities that are specific to that of the Zenin clan, which are the 10 Shadows technique and Heavenly Restriction. So Usami's probably just a descendant of somebody from the Inumaki clan who doesn't share their last name any longer. Anyways, outside of Usami, really the only true user of curse speech we've ever seen is Inumaki, or Doge Inumaki, but most people just refer to him as Inumaki. Now, curse speech is a pretty simple curse technique. It reinforces users' words with cursed energy, which compels those listening to act however the user of curse speech wants them to act. However, the more you dive into curse speech, the more complicated that it gets. See, curse speech can only be used by people who either bear the marking of the snake and its fangs, which is the curse seal marking that we see on Inumaki's mouth and tongue, or by users who have placed those seals on a curse tool, like when Yuta inscribes the seals on the side of a megaphone to use his copied technique that he gets from Inumaki. However, if hypothetically you do place the curse seal on your mouth, well, sure, if you say the word stop, everyone around you will be forced to stop. This also limits the amount of words you can say, because every word that you say that can be taken as a command is, and every command that you give affects your vocal cords. So if you accidentally said the word die and all the people around you did die, the backlash would also probably kill you. And because of this, a lot of curse speech users have to take precautions. See, Inumaki, unless he is of course trying to use his curse speech technique, only says ingredients that can be placed inside of an onigiri. And while those individual ingredients all have different meanings that the people around Inumaki are able to decipher, cipher. This, for all intents and purposes, basically makes Inamaki mute unless he's trying to use his technique. Now, Usami, who comes from a clan of people who seemingly have had 70 more years to master cursed speech and its repercussions, made the much better choice of, rather than deciding to place the cursed seal over his mouth and tongue, simply place it on the back of his hand. And therefore, whenever Usami wants to use cursed speech, all he has to do is remove his glove, place his hand over his mouth, and begin to give people instructions, which allows for Usami to talk like a regular person. Because unless his glove is off and his hand is over his mouth, he doesn't have to fear about accidentally firing off a command. And sure, he unfortunately looks like Zack Snyder's Joker, but that's a lot better than having to say salmon flakes for yes and bonito flakes for no. But accidentally firing off a command that you didn't mean to isn't the only weakness of cursed speech. See, while yes, cursed speech is probably one of the most versatile curse techniques in the entirety of JJK, because of its versatility, it had to be nerfed in some way. And that some way is backlash. See, Inamaki can't just be rolled out to battle against Sukuna and tell Sukuna, go unalive yourself. And the reason that Inamaki can't do that is because there is a massive disparity between Inamaki's strength and Sukuna's, and the severity of commands that a cursed speech user gives to the person that they're trying to control controls the amount of backlash that is launched on them and their vocal cords. So while yes, Inamaki, kind of like Frieren in a battle against Aura, could tell a low-level cursed spirit to go unalive itself, for Sukuna, the best that Inamaki could muster was stop, something that, mind you, completely crushed his vocal cords. Now, this backlash can be avoided by using less severe commands or just increasing your ability as a Jujutsu sorcerer. However, unfortunately, it really highlights just how helpless a cursed speech user can be when fighting against somebody stronger than them. However, because of the backlash usually inflicted on the vocal cords of the cursed speech user, they often have to keep things like lozenges and cough medicine on them in order to assuage their rapidly decaying vocal cords. Ties into the fact that if there are civilians around, a cursed speech user really can't do all that much, as if Inamaki was to say something like explode to a cursed spirit within earshot of a couple of civilians, those civilians would also explode. And yeah, cursed speech being the one inherited technique outside of the Jujutsu royal clans begins to make a bit more sense. Now, this doesn't mean that the technique itself is completely useless in crowds, as there are commands that Inamaki or any cursed speech user can use that are directed at individuals. Commands like crumble away, which makes a small concentrated gravity field over a certain area that Inamaki used to spike Geto into the ground, blast away, which fires off a cone of concussive force that blows away enemies, and hyper-specific commands like return, which forces a Shinigami to go back from whence it was summoned. The kind of command that would probably mean nothing to you or I, because what would I return to? So while yes, there are a ton of drawbacks with cursed speech, at the end of the day, it is still a highly useful curse technique, especially when you consider the fact that cursed speech commands can be recorded and used at a later date. But the recordings can only be used once, and when those recordings are played, the backlash will be inflicted upon the cursed speech user. So, like I said, pros and cons. But enough about those non-royal clan users with a straightforward and easily explainable curse technique. Let's get into the complicated things. Coming up at number 4 on our list of breaking all the inherited techniques in JJK, we have projection sorcery. Projection sorcery is an inherited technique of the Zenin clan. We know that because it was passed down from Naobito Zenin, the previous head of the Zenin clan, to Naoya Zenin, the misogynist who died by being stabbed by a kitchen blade. Now, projection sorcery is really as complicated as you want it to be. See, kind of like with cursed speech, users of projection sorcery don't really use innate techniques. They use projection sorcery, and then that's really it. And that's because projection sorcery, kind of like with cursed speech, lends itself to creativity. A creativity that falls within the confines of the inherited technique. See, in its simplest sense, projection sorcery traces 24 movements over the course of 1 second. So the second that somebody like Naobito or Naoya activates their projection sorcery, they and anybody they touch with the palm of their hand have to abide by the law of moving 24 distinct times every single second. This allows for the user to use their field of view to trace out 24 movements. And because these traces can be far from each other or feature a ton of movement, the fact that these projection sorcerers are able to fill those 24 frames of animation in just 1 second can make them appear as though they're moving unnaturally fast. And that's because they kind of are. Projection sorcerers like Naobito and Naoya have displayed level speeds that are not only baffling to special grade curse spirits, but also special grade curse users. And not only are projection sorcerers handed a ridiculous amount of speed, but like I said earlier, anything touched with the palm of their hand while their projection sorcery is active also has to abide by the 24 movements per 1 second rule. And if they're not able to abide by that law, they'll be stuck in a frame of animation for 1 second. And while 1 second doesn't sound all that fast, it's important to remember that projection sorcerers are able to move 24 times in just 1 second. And therefore, after their opponent is inevitably stuck in a still frame of animation, they're able to grab their opponent, who is now defenseless, and punch them out of that still frame, heavily injuring them. But like with all curse techniques, there are drawbacks. See, because it's not just those who have been inflicted by projection sorcery by the user that can be stuck in a still frame. If the person using projection sorcery doesn't move their 24 predetermined times in 1 second, they too can be stuck in a frame of animation. On top of that, if the course that they plan for themselves actively ignores physics, like let's say in one frame Naobito is running at the speed of sound and in the next frame he is completely still, that would be ignoring physics. It would be ignoring the momentum that Naobito has picked up by projecting himself to that speed. And therefore, in that frame of animation, when physics is ignored, the user would be snapped into a still frame. On top of this, there is an upper limit to the amount of speed that a user of projection sorcery is able to build up. However, if one keeps projection sorcery active for a long amount of time, they can continually increase their speed as they place the frames of every second a little bit further from each other, which is why now you ran in a circle a bunch to gain speed. He needed to allow for his speed and momentum to get to a point where he could extend every single frame from each other to a point where eventually he was running at his maximum speed. However, even while moving at maximum speed, projection sorcery still has the same defect, and that's that the 24 movements that you're about to make are predetermined. So if I'm here right now, and let's say I want to get over to that corner of my room, I can plan out 24 movements to get over there. And while it's only going to take me a second to get over to that corner of the room, if hypothetically in the second it takes me to get to that side of the room, somebody figures out that I'm going to go over there, and they understand what my route is most likely going to look like, and they begin to swing a sword in my path, I can't break out of the course of my path. So while I was maybe 7 out of the 24 moves into getting into that corner, I could see that there was a sword hurtling its way towards my belly, I'd still have to do the rest of my moves to get to the other side of the room, which would mean I could see the sword coming and I would still have to march inevitably to my death. Or I could break the rule of projection sorcery and miss one of my movements, which would snap me into a still frame of animation for my opponent to grab and probably stab. So, while yes, you can move unnaturally quick, and yes, you can force everybody to try and move 24 times in 1 second, there are still, unfortunately, some drawbacks. Or maybe, fortunately, neither Naobito or Naoya were really great guys. But enough about that eradicated clan. Let's talk about, well, the other eradicated clan. Because up next, at number 3 on our list, ranking all of the inherited techniques of JJK, we have blood manipulation. Blood manipulation is the inherited technique of the Kamo clan, or family, and is, I believe, the most commonly used technique we see in all of JJK. As we see Noritoshi Kamo, Chozo, and Yuji, and to a lesser extent, Esso and Chekisu, all use blood manipulation. Now, the reason that blood manipulation is seemingly so popular in JJK is because the OG Noritoshi Kamo, you know, the one that confoundingly shares a name with somebody born like 80 years after the most vile jujitsu sorcerer to ever live died, who was actually Kenjaku, made the Cursed Womb paintings. And as the Cursed Womb paintings were 9 half-human, half-cursed spirit fetuses that were forcibly aborted, and technically all of their fathers were Noritoshi Kamo, and therefore all of them have access to blood manipulation in one way or another. And heavy emphasis on the one way or another. See, because blood manipulation varies pretty massively depending on who's using it. See, while Noritoshi Kamo, the new one who just got the world's most unfortunate name, dips arrows in blood, which allows for him to control the trajectory of his arrows, allowing them to do things that otherwise arrows wouldn't be able to do, like turn around corners, accelerate after being fired, and so on and so forth. While Chozo more focuses on using his blood as a projectile, which makes sense because he has a near limitless amount, on account of the fact that he can convert his cursed energy, which he has a ton of. He is, after all, a special grade cursed spirit, into blood. But fundamentally, how does it work? Well, yes, blood manipulation seems like a relatively straightforward technique. It allows you to manipulate blood, right? It is a bit more complicated than that. See, well, yes, you can control your blood as if you were a waterbender in front of an ocean. You can take it one step further. See, not only can you control the motion and shape of your blood, but also you can control your blood's composition, its plasma, its red blood cell count, which allows you to do things like control your respiration and your heart rate in order to give you superhuman stamina. It allows for you to harden both internal and external blood to operate as a shield against incoming attacks. And as a blood manipulation user is only able to manipulate their own blood, and Gege didn't want to give blood manipulation users the ability to inject their blood into an opponent and then just blow them up from the inside, he decided to take blood manipulation one step short of that. See, rather than being able to inject their blood into an enemy and then blow them up from the inside, Gege rather gave blood manipulation users the handy buff of their blood being poisonous to the people they use it against. See, because if the blood manipulation user is a human, their blood is poisonous to cursed spirits, and therefore, so long as they're able to get even a tiny amount of their blood into their target, poison will begin to race through their body, effectively winning the fight for the blood manipulation user. Now, this does, however, mean that the blood of a human blood manipulation user is not poisonous to another human, but if you're, I don't know, half human, half cursed spirit, well then, fortunately for you, your blood is poisonous to everybody. Good news for Yuji and Chozo. Now, blood manipulation does have a ton of related techniques, all of which qualify as extension techniques. And earlier, I actually misspoke. A technique cannot be both inherited and innate. Techniques that spawn out of inherited techniques are extension techniques, not innate techniques. Though there are some weird gray areas like Esso and Chekisu's rot technique that does use their blood but isn't necessarily quantified as blood manipulation, but is very much an innate technique. Anyways, as we already talked about, different blood manipulation users seemingly use blood manipulation in a myriad of different ways. Whether that's flowing red scale, which allows for a user to amp their own physical capabilities by making their blood hotter and pump faster, convergence and piercing blood, which allows for a user to converge their blood down to its absolute breaking point and then fire it out as a laser beam, blood edge, which allows for the user to harden their blood into a blade of sort to stab a foe, or even supernova, which allows for Chozo specifically to, after using convergence, make multiple small orbs of blood that blow up like shotgun shells in all directions to catch people off guard. All in all, like with all the other inherited techniques we talked about thus far, blood manipulation is highly versatile. However, what makes it a better technique than the two we've already talked about is the fact that it has substantially less drawbacks. Now, some of you are probably thinking to yourself, Nick, what are you talking about? There are huge drawbacks with blood manipulation. And you're right. The average person who wants to use blood manipulation can only use like 1.5 liters of blood. Anything after that in your body effectively doesn't have enough blood to run on. And that's, mind you, if you're a man. If you're a woman, it's even less. And therefore, a lot of JJK fans do have a warped perception of how powerful blood manipulation is on account of the fact that the two people that we really see use it the most are Chozo, who has infinite blood, and Naruto Shikamo, who is constantly pulling out liters of his own blood to use in combat, really whenever he needs. And while it's safe to assume that any human blood manipulation user would probably do what Narutoshi does, once you're out of blood, you're either out of options or out of your life. And while sure, Naruto Shikamo does get around the weaknesses of having a limited amount of blood by the time that the Culling Games come around, that requires him to literally circulate his blood externally, oxygenating it with the air, allowing for him to have access to like 2.5 more liters of blood than he had before, which is nothing when compared to what Yuji and Chozo were able to pull off. So while yes, blood manipulation has as many glaring weaknesses as either curse speech or projection sorcery, unfortunately for the other two, the people that we see use blood manipulation are just inherently more powerful than the people that we see using projection sorcery or curse speech. But it's been a while since we talked about the Zenins, so let's get back to them. Coming up at number 2 on our list, ranking all of the inherited techniques in JJK, we have the 10 Shadows technique. Now listen, I know what some of you are saying, oh Nick, the 10 Shadows technique should be number 1 on this list. What about Big Raga the Obstoppa? What about Round Deer? What about Max Elephant? What about any of the 10 Shikigami? And yeah, the 10 Shadows technique is incredibly powerful. So powerful that Sukuna saw it and was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna need that. And honestly, it wasn't really until Sukuna got his grimy little, I guess, 4 sets of mitts on it, that we got to see truly how strong a 10 Shadows technique user could be. Because, well, yes, Megami is the inheritor of the 10 Shadows technique of the current generation, and therefore, after Naobito's death was elected as the head of the Zenin clan, Megami really isn't all that powerful of a 10 Shadows technique user. And yet still, as a 10 Shadows technique user who had yet to reach his potential, and You got it. Megami is a very powerful sorcerer. Slander him all you want. That is inherently the truth, which means that the power displayed by Megami could be substantially greater. And that's mostly to do with his inherited technique, the 10 Shadows technique. What is the 10 Shadows technique, and why did it give Megami so much potential? Well, the 10 Shadows technique is essentially a technique that allows for you to summon 10 Shikigami. See, while the user is born with the ability to summon 2 divine dogs, in order to gain access to any of the other Shikigami, the user then has to use those 2 divine dogs to exercise the other 9 Shikigami. And once those Shikigami have been defeated, they fall under the control of the 10 Shadows user. And while technically the exorcism ritual can be done with multiple people, if somebody does help the 10 Shadows user defeat the Shikigami, that Shikigami will not be subjugated. However, the user of the 10 Shadows technique does have to be careful about when and where they summon their Shikigami, because if a Shikigami is completely destroyed or killed in battle, it can never be summoned again. Now, like with all things in JJK, there's some exceptions to this rule, which mostly revolve around combining Shikigami in some way or another. That is to say that it was displayed to us that if one of the demon dogs dies, while that specific demon dog is no longer summonable, the energy of that demon dog is left behind and actually added onto the surviving demon dog, which makes them more powerful and ferocious. On top of this, if you combine 2 Shikigami, like Nue and Toad, and make a new Shikigami, like a Toad with wings, that Toad with wings can be destroyed and be summoned again, so long as both Nue and Toad are still alive. Now, this begs the question, why isn't Megami always just smashing his Shikigami together because they're essentially unkillable? And there's really no answer for that, unfortunately. Now, we've only ever technically seen 9 of the 10 Shikigami. There's Divine Dogs, the 2 dogs that every 10 Shadows technique user starts with, Nue, the gigantic electric owl, Toad, which is a toad that can grab things with its tongue, Great Serpent, which is a giant snake that does giant snake things, Max Elephant, which is able to hose down opponents with a mass volume of water or just crush them with its massive weight, Rabbit Escape, which summons hundreds of rabbits to distract the enemy while Megami escapes, Piercing Ox, which is an ox that can only run in a straight line, but the longer it's allowed to run in a straight line, the more speed and momentum it picks up. Round Deer, which I believe is the most massively underused out of all of the Shikigami, which is just a gigantic deer that is constantly pumping out positive energy, which therefore not only heals the 10 Shadows technique user, but also nullifies all incoming curse techniques. We see it used like once. And then of course, 8-handled sword divergent Silva Divine General Maharaga, aka an affront created by God to spit at humanity. The most powerful Shikigami available to 10 Shadows users that's able to adapt to any and all phenomena it interacts with. Stab it once, yeah, it might start bleeding, but when that wheel on its back starts spinning after it's done a full rotation, it will be immune to stab wounds. Now, as to how it's immune to stab wounds, well, either it now has impenetrable skin or it's way too fast for you to ever stab. How it adapts is truly up to it. If you attack it with a light speed attack, sure, it could make itself immune to light-based attacks, but it could also make itself faster than the speed of light, so light can no longer hit it. Not to mention that anything short of completely decimating Maharaga, that is to say, till nothing is left, will leave the door open for it simply regenerating its entire body. And don't worry, it doesn't have to bear the burden of its own adaptation. Yeah, the user of the 10 Shadows technique can take Maharaga's 8-handled wheel and put it on somebody else. And therefore, that person takes all the damage that Maharaga would, and when that wheel is done spinning, that wheel can be slapped back onto Maharaga, and it's immune to whatever that other person adapted to. And if all of that isn't enough, on its right arm is taped a blade called the Sword of Extermination, which radiates so much positive energy that it's able to destroy cursed spirits and cursed techniques simply by coming into contact with them. Now, there's also Tiger Funeral, but we've never seen that one. Now, naturally, like with all things in shonen universes, the more powerful the Shikigami, the more cursed energy is required to summon it. And therefore, the reason that you'll see a lot of 10 Shadows users relying on their weaker Shikigami is because the curse energy required to summon the big boys is sometimes too much for them. But if you don't care about running out of cursed energy or the aesthetic appeal of your Shikigami, you can just start mashing them together like different colored Play-Doh, which can give you something like Nue Totality Merged Beast Agito, a combination of Nue, Great Serpent, Tiger Funeral, and Round Deer, a humanoid abomination created by Sukuna that had the electricity of Nue and the healing ability of Round Deer. So a little bit better than frogs with wings. But that's the level of 10 Shadows technique user you can get to when you're apparently the only 10 Shadows technique user in history to defeat Maharaga. But unfortunately, even regardless of what Gojo said, even the 10 Shadows technique pales in comparison to our #1 entry on this list. And that's because at #1 on our list, ranking all of the inherited techniques in JJK, we have the Limitless. Oh, Nick, but the Limitless is useless without the 6 eyes. I don't care. I'm talking about users who have the Limitless and the 6 eyes. And also, we don't know what the Limitless looks like without the 6 eyes. We just know it's not as powerful as when you have both. See, as it is established that those in the Gojo clan who inherit just the Limitless have the ability to use the Limitless, but only those with the 6 eyes can truly master it. But considering the fact that the Limitless is an ability that allows for you to pull infinity as a concept into reality, allowing the user to manipulate and distort space, even if you haven't necessarily mastered the technique, I'd imagine that using it at any level is kind of crazy. But obviously using it if you have the 6 eyes is the craziest. Unfortunately, I guess for all of the criminals of the world, or at least the vast majority of them, Gojo is the first sorcerer in 400 years to be born with both the 6 eyes and the Limitless. But what is the Limitless? Well, I'd pull out your pens and papers right now because we're doing math. See, the base state of Limitless, or neutral limitless infinity, is essentially the power to stop things. The best way to explain it, if you don't understand what convergent and divergent sequences in mathematics are, is that between Gojo and the entire world is a barrier. And that barrier is relatively thick, and that barrier is divided into an infinite amount of smaller little barriers. And every single time something comes into contact with one of those smaller little barriers, its speed is halved. So while you could fire a projectile at Gojo that was going the speed of light, but it came into contact with the first thin barrier, it would be going half the speed of light, then a quarter, then an eighth, then a 16th, then a 32nd, then a 64th, then a 128th, and so on and so forth, until eventually the speed that that projectile was going was so infinitesimally small that it was basically not moving. Now, infinitesimal is a thing we're going to be talking about a lot. So what does that word mean? Well, essentially it means infinitely approaching zero, a number that is not zero but is so close to zero that it basically is. Now, the barrier of infinity around Gojo can be controlled by him. He can wear infinity like a vinyl glove. That is, say, it could be a layer a half a millimeter thick around his entire body. But it can also be expanded around Gojo like a dome. And it all really depends on exactly what Gojo wants to accomplish. If a swarm of flyheads is all trying to take Gojo down simultaneously, rather than letting them cover his entire body, though not technically touching him, he can expand his infinity to a bubble around him, allowing for him to still see. He also does this in situations like when he killed Hanami, as he expanded his infinity into Hanami as he pressed her into a wall, blowing her away into pieces. Now, this effectively makes Gojo untouchable, unless he gets caught in somebody else's domain expansion or somebody hits him with a domain amplification. See, the reason that being caught up in a domain expansion nullifies Gojo's infinity is because the sure hit effect of a domain expansion nullifies the need for an attack to travel, and therefore the concept of space between Gojo and the attack that's flying towards him in a domain expansion where he doesn't have his own simple domain protecting him doesn't mean anything, and rather the attacks just simply teleport to Gojo's skin. As for domain amplifications, by expanding a hollow domain around your fists, you're able to absorb the curse technique of Gojo, that is to say the infinity, into that hollow domain, which allows for you to suck away at infinity while you try to punch Gojo. The problem with this is, if you amplify your domain, something that people often do to try and nullify incoming curse techniques, you can't use curse techniques of your own, which basically just allows for Gojo to kill you as you have no real defenses. But if you really want to kill Gojo, the best way to go about it is either to use a curse tool imbued with a curse technique that nullifies other curse techniques like the inverted spear of heaven, or, you know, you just cut everything behind him, because why not? No one else ever thought of aiming behind a 6 eyes limitless user before. It had to be Maharaga. Anyways, outside of the neutral Limitless, Gojo also has access to things like his red and his blue, with his blue being his strengthened Limitless and his red being his reversed Limitless. See, as we covered, Gojo is able to expand his Limitless. And therefore, if he's able to control and expand his Limitless, it would make sense that he's able to control repulsive forces and attractive forces, though that one's a bit harder to explain. See, with Gojo's blue, he's able to amplify the cursed energy that he pours into the Limitless, infinitely converging space into a singular point, making essentially a black hole. And Gojo can do a lot of things with this blue. He can make a gigantic ball that he uses to destroy all the buildings around him, implode an individual, blast somebody away, or instantly teleport himself. See, as he's able to assign what's being affected by his blue, Gojo is able to mark himself as a being attracted by his blue to allow himself to instantly teleport. He also has to compress the space in front of him to allow for the movement to truly be instantaneous, because otherwise he would just be flying towards the blue, not teleporting to it. it. And thus kind of like how people believe a black hole could connect two very separate places in space. By essentially eliminating the space between himself and his blue, he's able to instantaneously teleport to that location. But if you use positive energy to control the Limitless, that is to say you times negative energy by negative energy to create positive energy and then pour that into a curse technique, you get red, which, as it is the opposite of the power to attract, creates the power to repel at twice the energy output of blue, which allows for Gojo to essentially make a death laser beam that blows everybody from Toji to Jogo to no-name cursed spirits away. But if you smash the positive energy of the red and the negative energy of the blue together, you get hollow purple. And as you combine the repulsive energy of the red and the attractive energy of the blue together, you create imaginary mass. Essentially, you're adding an infinitesimally small number to infinity, and you merge those two infinities together, which makes an imaginary number, imaginary mass, which not only pulls things in, but once they're pulled in, destroys them with the output of red, an ability with the strength to kill people like Toji, Maharaga, and almost Sukuna. But if that's not enough for you, there's also a domain expansion, Infinite Void, that when used on an opponent traps them in the concept of infinity, which forcefully jams all of the universe's information into their brain, overloading even the most powerful of sorcerers with information to the point where eventually they're placed into a catatonic state. So yeah, if I had taken inherited technique, you bet your bottom dollar I'm taking the Limitless. But what would you guys want? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go audition for a Naruto abridged role.